What did happen to the Moskva? Russia's flagship cruiser in the Black Sea out of action. Moscow claims a fire on board. Kyiv's crowing that it's down to a Neptune anti-naval missile. Either way, what impact on the Kremlin's designs on the entire Ukrainian coast and on morale for both sides? How will Vladimir Putin react as the West pledges more and more weapons to Ukraine? The Kremlin's threatening a new bombing campaign against the capital. And speaking of bombing, on day 50 of the war, it's anyone's guess what the actual casualty toll is in Mariupol. After 7 weeks, that city on the brink of falling. On that score, words matter. We will be asking about Emmanuel Macron's decision to hold off from calling it a genocide in Ukraine. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Russia as it regroups and Ukraine as it fights back. With us from Odessa, Hannah Celeste, Director of Security Programs at the Foreign Policy Council Ukraine Prism. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Retired General Dominique Trinquant, former head of the French military mission to the United Nations, is with us. Pleasure as always.
Good evening.
Anastasia Shapochkina, lecturer in geopolitics at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po, and chair of Eastern Circles. Remind us what Eastern Circles is.
The geoeconomics think tank.
The geoeconomics think tank. And from London, Aglaya Snektov, lecturer in international politics of Russia at University College London, UCL. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. First, let's try to shift through the claims and counterclaims over the Moskva, the Pentagon stating that it's still afloat and still on fire. Yinka Oyatade has more.
Ukrainian officials are calling it a resounding slap in the face of Russia. The Moskva, one of Moscow's most important warships, was left seriously damaged in the Black Sea, forcing its 500 sailors on board to evacuate. Russia says the damage was caused by a fire after ammunition on the ship exploded. Ukrainian officials claim a missile strike by its own forces caused the blast. They say the ship has now sunk.
In the Black Sea region, the cruiser Moskva was hit by Neptune anti-ship missiles. A fire started. Other ships tried to provide assistance, but a storm and the powerful explosion of ammunition turned the ship over and it started sinking.
Moscow has denied Ukraine's version of events. Russia's defense ministry claims the ship is still afloat, saying it will be towing the vessel back to port. The claims have not been independently verified, but Russian forces say President Vladimir Putin has been made aware of the incident.
The Commander-in-Chief receives reports from the military regularly about all the events, including news on the ship.
The 12,500-ton and 186-meter-long vessel is the pride of the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. It was involved in the first few hours of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. The loss of the Moskva would be a major setback for Russia as its forces shift their focus to the east of Ukraine. The Navy's campaign in the Black Sea has been crucial to supporting land operations in the southern and eastern regions of the country.
So, General Trinquant, the news is still fresh, obviously. Claims, counterclaims. It's difficult to sift through what they call the fog of war. If the Pentagon is to be believed, they're saying the ship was 60 to 65 nautical miles south of the port city of Odessa, where Hannah is. What does that tell you, that if it did get hit by a missile that far distance?
Interestingly enough, it was hit by a missile, which was initially a Russian missile, which have been upgraded by the Ukrainian.
For you, there's no doubt this was a missile.
Oh yes. I mean, we've got all the information about the fact that it was a drone who look over, who took the anti-aircraft system and then provide the grid reference for the missile, and 2 missiles were launched to the ship. So probably inside the ship the ammunition exploded after that, meaning that is not probably sinking now, but he was completely evacuated. And this is a major coup for the Russian Navy for different reasons. First, because it's the flagship. It's a big ship, an old ship, 83, I think, 1983, so an old ship. But it was commanding the fleet in the Black Sea. So currently they have to change the scheme of command in the Black Sea. Secondly, as we know, up to now, and we'll see, Odessa is not threatened by land because of the resistance in Mykolaiv. But there is a blockade in the sea. And so that's why it's very important to strike the Russian Navy, because there is no longer an Ukrainian Navy. This was destroyed. So fighting from the land on the ship was an important victory for the Ukrainian.
And last week, the British Prime Minister pledged anti-naval missiles as well. Will that be even more of a game changer?
It will be an increase in the firepower of the Ukrainian, of course, very, very useful. Because if we look at the picture on the map now, currently, we see that the Azov Sea will be Russian, but Odessa will be still Ukrainian. And Ukraine need this harbor to import things. And with the Russian vessel, it is not possible. So you need to strike on the Russian Navy in order to show that you want freedom of movement in this part of the sea.
Just one brief point on this. It's day 50 of the war. Are you surprised that Russia doesn't have air supremacy? Because they don't have full air supremacy.
No, exactly. They don't have air supremacy. And we are very surprised sometimes to see a Ukrainian fighter still flying. Which is surprising. We thought that all the aircraft were destroyed. That's not the case. Second thing is that the air defense is very powerful in Ukraine with short-range missiles, but now long-range. The S-300 have been destroyed, probably, but they are replaced by S-300 provided by European country. So I have the advice of a French Air Force officer. He told me that he was very surprised by the efficiency of the air defense. And that's why probably the Russians are no longer very often using aircraft, but using missiles, because they don't want to send their aircraft, which will be destroyed over the Ukrainian territory.
So, Hannah Celeste, what's the mood waking up in Odessa this Thursday?
Definitely, the Navy forces are quite happy because these Neptune missiles been added to their arsenal just in January this year. And we also need to understand what being so important about this Moskva ship. It's not only that is the biggest and it is the commanding, but this ship been controlling the air defense for the whole Russian Navy in the region. So it's been protecting them, first of all. But the second is it had on its board 16 caliber missiles. And these missiles been targeting not only Odessa region, but as far as the western and central Ukraine. So that is also very important in terms of the defense of Ukraine, its western part, but also in terms of the complete change of the air defense system now above the sea from the Russian point of view. But the moods are that it is just the beginning and that it's been very symbolic. People are joking because just yesterday our Ukrainian Post introduced the new postmark exactly with the picture of the ship and with the brave soldiers that being captured at the Snake Island at the very first days. And now it became like a symbol. They presented it and it's happened just the next day.
So that's the glass half full. Of course, the glass half empty could be, Hannah, to think that Russia's not going to stand idle and there's going to be a response.
That is for sure, but Russia is doing the responses all the time, and we see that today, during the day, there's been quite a significant concentration on the northeast of the country. We saw the movements of the Russian war airplanes coming to the border cities on the northwest of Ukraine. And definitely we're expecting that this night can be difficult because Russians usually prefer to strike around 11 p.m. and around 5 a.m. It's became already as a tradition for them within these 50 days.
All right, so the hitting of the Moskva, the Russians' Navy showcase battle cruiser. We saw in that report, by the way, those images of 2014 with Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi getting the grand tour from Vladimir Putin himself on board that ship. Its home port now, by the way, is Sevastopol in Crimea. Aglaya Snetkov, I'll put it to you then. When you think of the prestige associated with the Moskva, what's going to be the reaction from the Kremlin?
So it is symbolically very important, and I think it's also important as the Russians are ready to go and restart their well, not restart, but sort of follow the attack on Donbass, because it already shows that they're on the back foot. I think in terms of retaliations, I mean, added to the fact that the Ukrainians are said to have been hitting certain installations in the Russian territory, the Russians are currently seem to be ready to start hitting their threat of the military commanders in Ukraine. So that's something to look for. I mean, in terms of the Black Sea coast, that is currently, the taking over of Odessa is not on the agenda. That's not something that is, currently going to take place. So it is symbolic. It will be symbolic for Putin. It's symbolic of the state of the Russian military and the Russian Navy. There is a question as to why the three state air defenses did not operate and did not work despite the drones. So it is important, but it's not going to deter the Russian forces from continuing their campaign in eastern Ukraine.
Not going to deter them. Are you surprised? I'll put the question I put earlier to General Trinquant. Are you surprised at the way these 50 days have gone?
So surprised insofar as this entire campaign has been surprising. I mean, surprising insofar as the Russian expectations that they could do this within days is surprising and shocking at the same time. The fact that the Russians had been pushed back is not surprising, but it is obviously devastating that the war continues and that we're nowhere near the end, as the operations have shifted and are moving into readying for a greater fight in Donbass.
Anastasia Shapochkina, you heard there Aglaya mention how Russia stated its next aim is to try to take the Donbass. We saw the map earlier. Is that what Ukrainians are braced for, what the Russians are announcing?
As practice shows, whatever Russians say, be expected to see something the opposite of that. And when you look at the map and you listen to Putin's latest speech, which pretty much assures everybody and answers to the West's deepest hopes that his ambition and his appetite is going to be satisfied by the Donbass region as a whole, you see that total discord between that discourse and the map that we're seeing, where the operations are actually being implemented on the ground. And that region, the map shows us that most likely the ambition is to cut off Ukraine completely from the sea and to make it a much smaller, much industrially weaker landlocked nation, which of course would set it up for new possible military attacks in a few years. But may I just address also your earlier question about Russia's response, to cover just one angle which wasn't addressed before. Every time Russia is cornered or Putin is cornered, there are two types of response. One is, let's say, outward response, be it in Ukraine, be it, depending on the context, against the West, but also always there is an inward response. And what we have seen today also, that we saw a heart attack by the Minister of Defense of Russia, Sergei Shoigu, and the rest of 20 generals in Russia, as well as one of the people who was the great general for many years behind, especially the Novorossiya plan of Russia for Ukraine, who's Vladislav Surkov, who is now under house arrest as well.
That's not been confirmed.
That's been covered by several sources already. And
it's a claim made by several sources.
It's a claim made by some sources. But if this claim is true, it would be totally within the Russian normal response to any crisis, which is outward response, whatever the situation, but also inward response, which we could characterize as bombing Voronezh or
So do you
hitting
believe
themselves.
that Sergei Shoigu really did have a heart attack? Because we saw him disappear from the public eye right after the invasion on February the 24th.
Indeed, whether he had a heart attack or he was helped to have a heart attack, because heart attack in Russian political life is always a code word for any type of eliminating your adversary. Is somebody is unwanted by the power and therefore he has a heart attack all of a sudden. And that is a very classical expression. So for me, that's also something that's part of the Russian response. And of course, a response to failure of the whole operation over 50 days, which went much worse than what Russians had expected, thanks to the Ukrainians' response and also the Western support.
Well, let's pick up on one of the names that's come to the fore suddenly. The recent appointment of Army General Alexander Vornikov as commander of the Ukraine war. Vornikov, who oversaw the bombing campaign in Syria. Let's listen to the reaction to the reshuffle in the high command out of Washington.
Well, I would say our view is that even a changeover in personnel or leadership at the top is not going to erase the fact that this is a strategic a failure for Russia. What we should all be aware of, and we are certainly aware of, is this is a general who was already responsible for overseeing atrocities in Syria, and that we would expect that it would be a continuation of the type of atrocities we've already seen take place in Ukraine.
Now, General Tankol, of course, you followed the events in Syria over the past decade. What was your reaction when you saw that General Vornikov was taking over the high command for this campaign?
My reaction has nothing to see with Syria. My reaction is that at last the Russians are taking a sensible, in military term, a sensible decision. They are concentrating their efforts on one victory, which is southeast of Russia, and not on 4 different axes, which they did during 4 weeks, and they had failure on 3 axes. So they are putting all the means behind the victory in the southeast. That's the first point. Second point, they are appointing a general in charge of the operation. That was not the case before. That was the Ministry of Defense, who had 4 different axes and 4 different commanders. Now there is one commander. And I think that this commander have one duty: to achieve victory prior to the 9th of May. And this is what he has as a duty.
But what's the definition of victory? He is a general associated with carpet bombing in cities like Aleppo.
Victory is, you're right, you need to look back inside Russia. The language is victory is liberating Donbass. And this is the language for the Russians. And that's very important. He needs to defeat the Ukrainian army, which is facing Donbass, which is the best part of the Ukrainian army, and to show that now the Azov Sea is Russian. There is the link between Crimea and Donbass. I don't think that Odessa will be in the scope. It's too far, too difficult for the Russian army currently. So this is, for us, it will show a failure. For the Russian people, it's a victory. And going back to your point on the fact that they are changing the general, this is a real problem for us, because the chief of staff of the American army, of the American services, CDS, or British or French, are used to talk to these people in Moscow. And now they don't know. When they phone, there is no one at the phone. And this is a problem.
But surely the French High Command knows General Vornikov because we were involved in the French in Syria, so they must know him.
No, but the problem is not to talk to him, because he's running the operation. So you don't talk to him. You talk at the Ministry of Defense and the Chief of Defense Staff. And if they have changed, you don't know to who you will talk. And probably someone you don't know. And in war, and specifically when you are talking about nuclear threat, you need to talk to people you know, because then you can understand what they want, where they are going. If you're ringing, there is no one, or just a private saying the general is ill or something like that, it's a catastrophe. It's a real problem.
Before I go to Hannah Celeste on this, Aglaya Snetkov, I just want your reaction to this change in the high command and what you heard from Anastasia a moment ago about the defense minister Sergei Shoigu.
So, I mean, I think it is significant that for the first time we essentially have one coordinated person for this campaign, and all military experts have been talking about how this has been unprecedented, trying to essentially lead an operation on three sides without one single person who's coordinating everything. And for the Russian previous campaigns, they've always normally had somebody in charge. So this was also unprecedented, even from the point of view of Russian sort of war history. I think in terms of Shoigu, I mean, I have seen sort of rumors on Twitter. I have seen information flying around. At this stage, we don't know. That's what I would say, whether or not the state of Shoigu, whether he is in intensive care. I know that this has been sort of claims have been made. He hasn't been seen in recent days. Whether he will reappear, it's a question mark. Whether Putin needs to essentially remove him in such a way, whether he could be sidelined in other ways, it's all up for debate. But I think militarily speaking, we will see a more focused Russian campaign that, hasn't been the case until now. And I think that's sort of the important issue to focus on. And I think potentially the type of combat operations that we saw in Aleppo, the type of combat operations we saw in Grozny is probably something we will also continue seeing the Russian forces exerting on the ground. Something to keep in mind is that to some extent, Vornikov doesn't have as much experience leading such a large military campaigns. Most of the ones that he has led and been involved in has been much more focused, smaller scale, and concentrated. Agreed, absolutely agreed. But it just means that although he is going to be the person in charge, that does not mean that he has the expertise of essentially following a conventional war in such a way. So it doesn't mean that the Russians...
Yeah, I was just going to bring in Hannah Celeste on this. So the good news, if you're Ukrainian, is he doesn't have experience on something as ambitious as trying to invade another country. But the bad news is that he's got plenty of experience when it comes to carpet bombing.
Not only the carpet bombing, but in general, he is a general who has the practical experience, the real war experience. Previously, we need to understand that not all Russian generals really had that experience of the last years, except for the Syrian campaign. I'm not talking about Nagorno-Karabakh actions of Kazakhstan, because that's been not a military operation of this kind. And the second bad news is definitely this coordination mechanism that finally been established, about what my two co-panelists just perfectly described, that after 50 days we have these. So as for now, that is definitely several bad news, but let's see how it will be on the ground, because definitely that is very important to notice. First of all, that sometimes we are overestimated the Russian forces, forgetting that they're acting according to the Soviet tactics and Soviet hierarchy. And that would make, especially in terms of control, command, coordination, them very weak in Ukraine. I'm a little bit surprised that so many of you are shocked by the Ukrainian armed forces performance, because for the last 8 years, the NATO and different NATO countries been training Ukrainian armed forces exactly in this. We had one of the NATO trust fund for the command and control. So now we have a lot of the middle level officers who can take initiative, who know how to operate. They think differently already on the ground. They are not waiting for the command from Moscow. And that what is very different with the Russian armed forces. For each of the decision, it's either local atrocity of what we saw in Bucha or Irpin, or it is the waiting for the big command from Moscow that makes them slower and less agile to the situation on the ground. But definitely the reputation of General Vornikov is something to worry about. The new atrocities or the new violations and the war crimes, that is still on the agenda.
Still on the agenda. And again, we're speaking, Hannah, after the taking out of the flagship vessel of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and just after as well, this new pledge by Washington and the new list of weapons that they're sending to Ukraine runs long. What is it? Some 300 of these so-called switchblade drones, 11 attack helicopters, much more. Is that enough to turn the tide?
That is not the only things that Ukraine is receiving. The question is that most of the countries, except of UK maybe and US, prefer not to announce it loudly before these ammunition or equipment would be delivered to Ukraine. That's done a little bit of secrecy, but because of the security arrangements, we understand that each of these supply is under the serious threat from the Russian attack. We just received the APCs from Australia. Try to imagine. So even that far, the assistance is coming to Ukraine. More weapons are still needed because we are talking about huge territory. You need to imagine that Ukraine is the first biggest by territory in Europe. The geographical center of Europe is on the west of Ukraine. So we need to cover the whole territory. And Russia is definitely, they can be bad in terms of morale and coordination, but they are definitely outnumber us in terms of missiles, in terms of airplanes, and in terms of personnel. That's why it is very important to have more sophisticated weapons and ability to use it at the whole perimeter of the country. That's why, let's see, we're asking for more. We're asking for better equipment than what we have now, not only the old Soviet, for example, things that still like airplanes or tanks that are in the Eastern European countries, but we already probably made the best advertisement for javelins and lore of the Brits or the Bayraktars of the Turkish. Ukrainian forces definitely demonstrated that we know how to use the weapons.
Yeah, there was the old saying during World War II, the old slogan you saw on posters, loose lips can sink a ship. So there is a certain amount of secrecy. France among the Western nations pledging more military assistance. Let's look at a tweet on Wednesday from the French Defense Minister, Florence Parly. She's saying, following a new request by Ukraine, I've announced to my counterpart that France will deliver additional military capacities above and beyond the 100 million euros worth of material donations already implemented. Additional military capacities. Wow, that's as vague as you can get. General Trinquant, what is it that we're talking about here?
First thing, prior to delivery, don't talk about things like that. That's the first thing. Second thing, we must be careful about the fact that delivery weapons, from where the weapons are coming, from stocks, okay? So when you're talking from Eastern country, from Europe, you know, Romania, Poland and all that, they've got very big stocks from the old Soviet Union in the country.
Slovakia, Poland.
So they are able to provide this equipment because they are not using this equipment and because the Ukrainians know how to use it. Second thing, at the same time we are delivering weapon system.
Well, about the Switchblade drones, the Americans are saying it'll take them just a few days for the Ukrainians to learn how to use them. Tell us about those Switchblade drones. What are they?
Because they are drones which were used and built at the time of the Afghan war. So, as you know, there is no longer U.S. in Afghanistan, so they've got the stock, they've got it. But just let me finish on the fact that we are providing weapons. That at the same time, we are establishing better defense in NATO. To establish better defense in NATO, you need your weapon system. So you will not provide the weapon system you are using in NATO to the Ukrainian because you have to deter the Russian to attack NATO. And to deter the Russian to attack NATO, you need to have the right level of stocks, weapons, and ammunition. So you can't provide, you know, say the French army don't have stocks for everybody. They've got stock for the French army. So what are they providing? They are providing old system like the Milan missile, which was provided prior to the war, SATCP, the anti-aircraft missiles too, and normal equipment. But it's very difficult. We will certainly not provide our tanks and our artillery. We've got very few of them. So.
Again, the U.S., I get back to this because it's a surprise. The U.S. pledging 11 attack helicopters. You wouldn't give an attack helicopter if you thought it was going to be shot out of the sky the first time.
But these helicopters are Russian helicopters, in fact. Russian built. They are Mi-17. You know, so the Americans are saying we are providing the weapon system, but in fact the weapon systems are coming from stocks in Eastern Europe. And which very often have been upgraded at the Western standards, but they are providing this system. And going back to the drones and the anti-aircraft missiles and all that, the US Army is huge. They've got huge stocks. That's not the case in Europe.
Anastasia Shapachkina?
I would like to address this point that, General, thank you for raising, is how can NATO better deter Russia? I think this is the key question. So far, NATO's response to this question was exactly this, is that we can deter Russia by providing some weapons to Ukraine, but we cannot give the true weapons, the heavy weapons, the land to air missiles, the long-range missiles, the mid-range missiles, because we don't have enough. And the answer to that, to me, it seems it is twofold. First of all, to deter Russia, you cannot just arm the countries which are not being currently attacked, because that sends a counterproductive signal to Russia that that the West is pretty much hiding behind the couch or hiding behind Ukraine, and while at the same time stalking the necessary equipment. So kind of leaving Ukraine kind of to face its fate with the equipment, the necessary equipment, but which is not going to allow it to hold on for too long because the West is afraid for itself. And that is a completely normal fear. However, it is a fear. So it is rather a sign of weakness than of strength. And second, it doesn't, the way to counter that fear is not by holding on to the few helicopters or few systems which are important, which you have, but rather to think how you can rejuvenile your own military industrial complex, which is something that the US has been excellent at for the whole history of itself, the modern history since World War II, because that's part of its own economy, integrated part. And part of the reasons that US hopefully can actually go further than just supplying the Soviet-made system, but maybe supplying some other system, I think is also a big chunk of it is also a political will in the US itself, which is a very complex environment, but is also the fact that some of their own equipment may need to be dismantled, so to say. And one of the ways of dismantling an equipment is providing it to war zone. And that's what, but of course, the way for Europe to get there is not, in my opinion, to sit, under the table and hold on to what Europe has, but to invest into the military industrial complex of Europe.
Exactly, but that's what Europe is starting to do. But the problem is it's a long way, It is. If you look at the budget in Europe, France is the only country to have increased its budget for the 5 last year.
Germany didn't?
No, Germany now.
No.
But for the last 5 years, no. And to rebuild equipment like that, it takes 5, 6, 7, 10 years. So we are starting that. That's why very often I say that there are 3 victories for Putin. Resuscitation of NATO, accelerating of Europe.
That's a victory for...
Well, it's a joke, of course.
Right.
And unification of Ukraine. These are the 3 victories for Putin. And we should show that to the Russian people. He is as a victory exactly the opposite way as he was expected to have.
Right. So it's been a boomerang effect. Aglaya Snetkov, your reaction when you hear Anastasia to talk about the West perhaps showing a bit of its weakness. Like, what is the Kremlin thinking at this point?
I mean, I think that despite showing some of the weakness, I think the Kremlin is clearly surprised by the extent to which the West has been arming and militarily supporting Ukraine. I don't think they expected that. I think had they expected it, they would have perhaps reconsidered the campaign. They might be talking and sort of having the PR propaganda that, they're happy to fight the West is against them, NATO's against them, etc. But I don't think they expected such a turnaround, despite the military support that Ukraine has received and sort of the training operations Ukraine has received since 2014. And I think the US in this regard has come out, at the forefront. And if you look at the Biden meetings, for example, with the military industrial complex this week in the US, it clearly shows that the Americans are aware that they're in it for the long haul, and they will keep having to have the sort of the production lines to ensure that they can continue resupplying the US. The Ukraine. Something else to bring on board is not just the supplying of military equipment, but also intelligence. I think Western intelligence has played a major role in this campaign. It's one of the ways in which the Ukrainians do know where to target. That's been mentioned, but often we don't know exactly how much is being provided, because that really is being kept quiet about. But I think that's been substantial, and the Americans have this week upped the extent of their intelligence support to Ukrainians. And I think that's also very significant, because it's not just about the weapons on the ground, it's also about sort of knowing where to target them. And the West is supporting that.
Right. And there is this feeling then that perhaps there is this unity behind Ukraine. Still, though, Russia, for the last days, has been on the brink of seizing Mariupol. There's been a 7-week siege there, a city where we've had tens of thousands killed, according to the mayor. And we've heard the U.S. president employ the word genocide regarding what Ukrainians have found in cities where the Russians have pulled back. On Wednesday, the French president, who's on the campaign trail for re-election, spoke of war crimes in Ukraine, but distanced himself from Joe Biden's use of that word genocide.
It is madness what's happening right now. It's unbelievably brutal. It's the return of war in Europe. But I look at the facts at the same time. I want to try my best to continue to be able to stop this war and rebuild peace. So I'm not sure the escalation of words is helping the cause.
Yeah, Macron's words triggering a measure of blowback from his Ukrainian counterpart. Let's listen to Volodymyr Zelensky.
This statement, if it is true, I will immediately. We never miss a single detail. Such language is very painful for us, so I will definitely do my best to discuss this issue with him. If not today, then tomorrow, whenever he's available.
That was Zelensky speaking on Wednesday in the company of the visiting presidents of Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Hannah, Celeste, your reaction to Emmanuel Macron deciding let's not yet use the word genocide?
If, first of all, very briefly, one phrase about the weapon supply that we finished before this. You need to compare, for example, Estonia, the NATO member state, provided to Ukraine 2 times more military aid than France, and much more efficient. And the reason is that they understand that the battle now and deterrence of the Russian now is happening in Ukraine. France is 2,000 kilometers from here and from Russia. Estonia is very, very close to Russia. It seems to me that probably the big NATO member states should listen to the Eastern European partners and to the Baltic states of their reasoning why they're providing the weapons, understanding that maybe you can have a little bit less in your storages, but that means that the other countries and just protecting you and defending the values and your real and normal life that you can live as for now. But if we speak about the genocide and the statements, you know, it's what really touched Ukrainians. It's not only the rejection to speak about genocide, because here I understand that we can speak about the legal connotations, about the numbers, about investigations, but that in the end, he said, it is not a genocide because Ukrainians and Russians are brotherly nations. And that's really sounded extremely odd and irrespected because first of all, what does mean the brotherly nations? That is the term that Soviet Union used predominantly. You don't speak about Belgians and French as the brotherly nations, or you don't speak about all those who've been in the French Empire as the brotherly nations. And definitely brothers are not doing all those atrocities and war crimes that we are now experiencing in many cities around Ukraine. Bucha and Mariupol just became very famous because of the news, but I can name you dozens of the towns and villages. And if you see the photos, what I see daily of my friends' houses around Kyiv, what's happened there, or when for the last months I can't reach several of my friends in Mariupol because we just don't know what is happening with them, or when I see what is happening in Kharkiv, that is definitely gives me a reason to think. But in the very beginning, let's be honest, Ukraine also, we're not talking about the genocide. We started to speak about genocide when we had these pictures pictures of and facts of atrocities. By the way, French gendarmes are now in Bucha and Irpin, and they are documenting and helping us to have for the International Criminal Court all the evidences about the war crimes there. But when we also hear the accompanied statements of Mr. Putin, of Mr. Medvedev, and of many of the Russian members of parliament, the last week their statements are saying about eliminating of Ukraine, eliminating of Ukrainian people, punishing Ukrainian people. And I'm quoting now, I'm not exaggerating. In Medvedev posted to Telegram, he just said that probably after the Russian victory over Ukraine, we should forget about using the name Ukraine for the country. Or today I read the statements of the Russian officials about the division of Ukraine and the country, so to punish Ukrainians for many years in advance. That's what's making genocide, because it's definitely the aim and the means that the Russian armed forces and the Russian politicians are now having against Ukraine.
Anastasia Shapachkina, in the case of Emmanuel Macron, is it good that he's keeping the channels of communication open with Moscow?
It's a good excuse to keep good terms with Moscow, especially considering the significant business interest France still is having in Russia, including Total, for example, with major investments in oil and gas exploration, Technip, also an engineering firm participating in some of these projects which have been going on for years and has no intention of leaving Russia. And these are the companies, especially Total, which have important government participation in them. Government is a shareholder in these companies. Second, it is a sign of pro-Russian political lobbying, both in the political establishment of France and probably also in the military establishment, which is a historical truth. It is historically an important presence. Himself, Emmanuel Macron, was hopeful that sanctions were going to end against Russia back when he was Minister of Economics in 2016. But just to come back to this genocide as a word, of course, it is a good excuse to say that, well, in fact, this is ethnically the same people, whether brotherly or not. Indeed, put a Russian, put a Ukrainian, hard to tell apart. However, the definition of genocide is not about ethnicity alone. The definition of genocide is a deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with a goal of destroying that nation or ethnic group. And therefore, it is not enough that they are the same ethnicity, even if that's the case. This is a different nation, and Putin and the establishment have, as Hannes has underlined, many times over of last week that their goal is destroying Ukraine as a nation.
General Trinquant, that fact-finding mission that Hannah talked about of French gendarmes that are in Bucha this Thursday, is that going to dispel any doubts on the mind of the president?
I think it will help building the case. I mean, you've got to build the case. You know, you've got on one side a political position on genocide, and you've got on the other side the fact that you've got to establish the case, and which for the French side...
Could Macron have called it a genocide like Joe Biden did?
No, I don't think so, because we'll need to build the case. They are war crimes. No question about that. If you had a genocide, say, I will be very rude, in the village, you will see no one. All the women will be killed. All the children will be killed. This is a genocide. But I'm not a lawyer, so I leave the lawyer establish the case. Just 2 points in addition. About Estonia, very fine. But we've got French soldiers on Estonia's soil to defend Estonia. We've got French aircraft flying to have the air cover of Estonia. So France is doing many things to help all the NATO countries to defend them and to Ukraine. And on the channel, at the same time as there is war, as I was talking about general who had to talk to each other, you need to have a channel open and be able to talk to the man who is leading that. There are very few phone calls now, but you need to have a channel open. When there is a problem, when you scale up to nuclear threat or something like that, you need to talk to someone. If you never talk to him, you will never have him at the phone and try to scale down the situation, you know?
We're out of time, Hannah, Celeste, but do you agree?
that's why Ukraine has the negotiations like in Istanbul between Ukraine and Russia. The question is you reaching at least something? Emmanuel Macron tried to negotiate the green corridors from Mariupol and delivery of humanitarian aid. He didn't manage to succeed even in this. And that's why that is a big question, what type of the communications you have and what do you reach? And especially when these communications are not supported by the real actions or at least some decisions on the ground. I mean, these 20 calls, what is the result? Do we see at least something from them? It looks like, as for now, they are not that successful. So probably the tactics should be adjusted a little bit.
All right, and we'll finish on the phone call earlier from France's foreign minister to his Ukrainian counterpart, promising that very soon the embassy would be transferred back to Kyiv from the western city of Lviv. I want to thank you, Hannah Celeste, for joining us from Odessa. I want to thank Aglalia Snetkov in London, Anastasia Shapochkina, General Trinquant. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.